On July 26th, we will celebrate 31 years since President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law, making it illegal to discriminate against people with disabilities. One of the most iconic and symbolic measures and results of that bill being signed into law are these: curb cuts, which became mandatory when constructing city streets throughout the United States. These curb cuts are a great symbol for diversity, but also more importantly, inclusion.
Dan Lokoko, a disability advocate and speaker, said the Americans with Disabilities Act was an important piece of civil rights legislation.
It was a red letter day. It continues to be a day that we have to celebrate, as we will on the July 26th, celebrating ADA 31. But it was a long time in coming, a great milestone, a great turning point in civil rights for people with disabilities and their allies and family members.
After World War II, a large contingency of veterans returned home with mobility-related injuries. Accessibility was anything but accessible. These veterans and others with disabilities did all they could to make it easier for themselves to get to and from where they were going. Thus, the push for change began. In 1945, Jack Fisher of Kalamazoo, Michigan, was a disabled veteran and lawyer. He helped lead an effort that led to his hometown installing the nation's first curb cuts to facilitate travel in the downtown area for wheelchair users and others who couldn't navigate the 6-inch curb heights on downtown sidewalks. The next step in inclusion was the signing of the Architectural Barriers Act of 1968 that required government buildings to make themselves universally accessible, but it didn't apply to sidewalks. That was until the 1970s. A group of people in Berkeley, California poured cement into the form of a ramp. Afterward, they were threatened to be arrested by police. They weren't arrested that day, but what did happen was the next key moment in inclusion history. In 1972, pressed by disabled advocates, Berkeley installed its first official curb cut at an intersection on Telegraph Avenue. From there, disability advocates continued to push governments of all levels for inclusion. Then, on July 26, 1990, President George H.W. Bush signed the Americans with Disabilities Act into law. The ADA, as it's commonly referred to as, prohibits disability-based discrimination and mandated changes to the built environment. One of those changes was the curb cuts. That innovation changed not only the lives of those with disabilities or mobility challenges, but it changed the lives of millions of Americans. Parents pushing strollers headed straight for curb cuts. So did workers pushing heavy carts, business travelers wheeling luggage, even runners and skateboarders. A study of pedestrian behavior by a local journalist at a shopping mall in Sarasota, Florida, revealed that 9 out of 10 encumbered pedestrians went out of their way to use a curb cut. Dan Lokoko is proud of the progress of the ADA, but said there are still gaps to be filled.
Well, one of the challenges of the ADA is the fact that the enforcement of the ADA doesn't happen until someone makes a complaint. So, with the exception, building codes and so forth really have come a tremendously long way, but there are many aspects of the ADA that unless someone says, I have a need or I cannot access, nothing happens. And that does two things. One, it creates a continuing barrier for accessibility, but it also creates a need for accommodation on the fly, if you will, because people who are trying to go about their own lives, who happen to have a disability, will find themselves regularly stuck. And that's where elements of cultural competence, cultural humility surrounding the inclusion of people with disabilities becomes so important.
What's the old saying? You don't know there's a problem until there is one. So, is there a way to get ahead of potential challenges? Dan Lokoko says yes.
There are, through advocacy, through people being aware, people having an understanding of what the ADA is and what it covers. And certainly there's a lot of foresight that goes in, as I say, particularly in areas of construction, building accessibility, building codes. There are a lot of guidelines that come out of the Justice Department, and yet there are still those gaps. And that's where people helping each other comes in. The ADA was never designed to solve every problem instantly. It was designed to be an ongoing growth, but therefore it's an ongoing situation where there are still gaps in accessibility, which mean gaps in the ability for people with disabilities to live their lives as anyone else has a right to.